Why is Spanish still spoken in Latin America but not in the Philippines? You've heard it all before, as some have said that the Indians died off from diseases brought by Europeans and were mainly replaced by Spaniards and Criollos. That's why Spanish is still spoken in Latin America. Or they taught Spanish in Latin America but not in the Philippines, as they didn't want the natives to learn Spanish, so the Spanish missionaries learned the Filipino languages instead. Are these true? To answer this question, we'll rely heavily on the book written by Nicholas Ostler called Empires of the Word, A Language History of the World, first published in 2005. It explores the history of human civilization through the lens of language dominance and decline. Ostler takes a unique approach by showing how languages have spread, endured, or disappeared over time, not through conquest alone, but also through trade, religion, administration, and cultural influence. Our starting point would be the royal decree of June 7, 1550, issued by the Holy Roman Emperor and simultaneously King of Spain, Charles V in Valladolid, recognized as the first explicit decree demanding the teaching of Castilian or Spanish in the Spanish colonies. This decree emphasized the importance of teaching Spanish to indigenous people to facilitate their instruction in Christian doctrine and assimilation into Spanish custom. This decree marked the beginning of official Spanish language policy in the colonies, aimed at religious and cultural assimilation, which also covered the Philippines when the Spanish set themselves up here. Now, the church had initially supported the use of indigenous languages that were in general use, or lenguas generales, in Spanish America for evangelization, as these were more effective for converting native populations and for evangelizing. So, the reaction to the said royal decree of 1550 was mixed. But Nicholas Ostler writes in his book that
there is no evidence that the church deliberately restricted access to Spanish. Rather, they made it part of the curriculum, along with Latin, in all their schools. It simply failed to catch on among Indians, largely isolated as they were in remote settlements, or in segregated communities, with few non-bilingual Spaniards to talk to.
Now, to summarize Ostler, it's safe to say that the law was inconsistently enforced due to practical difficulties and resistance from some clergy who favored indigenous languages, while some regions maintained their indigenous languages, for example, Nahuatl, Quechua, Guaraní, especially where they were already widespread or had missionary linguistic support, others saw rapid decline. Spanish was never fully imposed across the empire due to geographic and demographic challenges, reliance on bilingual intermediaries, competing priorities, evangelization versus linguistic unification. Spanish was largely limited to urban areas in mestizo society, with indigenous languages remaining dominant in many rural or remote areas. So it turns out that during Spanish colonial rule there, instead of spreading Spanish widely, the colonizers used pre-existing indigenous languages like Nahuatl, Quechua, Aymara, and Guaraní to communicate their worldview and administer colonial governance, just like in the Philippines. These languages, already established through former empires or trade networks, were adopted for preaching, administration, and literature. Nahuatl thrived in Mexico due to the dual republic system and clerical efforts. In Peru, Quechua was used for both evangelization and preserving Incan heritage. Guaraní gained exceptional status in Paraguay, partly due to Jesuit missions that promoted the language as part of their effort to protect indigenous people and foster local priesthood similar to the church's use of Latin in Europe. Ostler writes,
in the middle of the 18th century, when Spain had dominated the Americas for fully 10 generations, many Spaniards were disappointed in the very much less than universal spread of their language. Rosenblatt estimates that in the Spanish colonies in 1810 there were 3 mother tongue speakers of an indigenous language for every one who had grown up with Spanish, 9 million rural Indians to 3 million whites, Creoles, and mestizos.
Please take note of the estimates in 1810, just a few years before the independence movement finally kicked out Spain from Spanish America. While estimates vary depending on sources, the main idea is that Spanish wasn't yet the dominant language that it is today over there. So it does not look like everybody spoke Spanish there in the early 19th century. The push for Spanish.
Further summarizing Ostler, he says that in 1769, Archbishop of Mexico Antonio de Lorenzana had proposed the abolition of all indigenous languages in favor of the exclusive use of Spanish. Though initially rejected by colonial authorities and the Council of the Indies, King Carlos III approved the idea, issuing the Royal Decree or Cedula of 1770 to replace indigenous languages across the Spanish Empire. While the decree mainly changed clergy appointment policies, it marked a turning point. Funding and institutional support for indigenous languages vanished. Universities dropped related programs, courts stopped accepting pleas in Nahuatl, and publishing in native languages ceased. A follow-up decree in 1782 reinforced Spanish language instructions but had limited practical effect. Simultaneously, the church's influence had declined, especially after the expulsion of the Jesuits in 1767, who had been key protectors and promoters of native languages. The combined loss of institutional, educational, and clerical support led to the gradual collapse of the major indigenous languages across the empire. The liberal enlightenment in Spanish America advanced beyond promoting Spanish over indigenous languages and reducing church influence. Its major next step was political. The Wars of Independence in the early 19th century. These were led primarily by criollos, European-descended elites born in the Americas who resented being subordinate to Spanish-born rulers. Now, think of the insulares in the Philippines. That's what the criollos were in Spanish America. Although the criollos sought support from mestizos, blacks, and indigenous people, they largely rejected indigenous languages as national symbols. Instead, they promoted Spanish as the unifying language for the new republics, viewing native languages as divisive. As a result, nationalist movements in Latin America often sidelined local languages in favor of a shared Spanish-speaking identity. However, it must be said that language outcomes in Latin America varied significantly based on local conditions. Ostler provides two contrasting cases, Mexico and Paraguay, to illustrate this diversity. Mexico. Since independence in
1821.
Mexico struggled with the Indian question, often viewing indigenous identity as an obstacle to national unity. While revolutionary leaders like Morelos invoked indigenous heritage, later policies aimed to dissolve indigenous land rights and promote assimilation. The idea of indigenismo emerged, which celebrated indigenous culture symbolically while pushing for a unified national identity in Spanish. As a result, Spanish spread rapidly, from 45% Spanish speakers in 1810 to 88% by 1995. Again, please note the numbers here. Not everybody spoke Spanish during Spanish colonial rule, and it was only after independence, when the Mexican government pushed Spanish all throughout Mexico, that they achieved more widespread use of Spanish from the 19th to the 20th century. Paraguay. In stark contrast, Paraguay has maintained strong bilingualism between Spanish and Guaraní since colonial times. Due to early intermarriage and the country's geographic isolation, Guaraní remained widely spoken and was never replaced by an urban Spanish-speaking elite. Guaraní became a symbol of national identity, playing roles in warfare and politics. Though Spanish is the official language, Guaraní was declared a national language in 1967. As of 1996, 95% of Paraguayans were fluent in Guaraní, with over half monolingual in it. Given this, Ostler writes,
The general verdict on the penetration of Spanish into the Americas must be that it has had a narrow escape. Despite over 2 centuries of residence and elite dominance in the continent, Spanish-speaking society, constantly refreshed as it was by immigration from the Iberian Peninsula, did not put down deep roots in the colonies.
So, wow, this is certainly not what we think of here in the Philippines. We think that what's true today, that Spanish is universally spoken in Hispanoamerica, was always like that even during the Spanish period. And it turns out that's not the case. That's just a case of presentism. So what did Ostler say about Spanish in the Philippines?
As in the Americas, the local languages had been accepted as the medium for preaching the gospel. Printing had started in the Philippines at much the same time as in the more advanced American colonies, Mexico and Peru. In 1593, a woodblock edition of Doctrina Christiana, a parallel text in Spanish and Tagalog, was his first product. Since there were few Spanish settlers, and little serious economic development, there was small inducement for the Spanish language to be used outside official circles. Nevertheless, there was a significant belated effort to spread knowledge of it. Carlos II's royal cedula of 1770 applied just as much to the Philippines as to the Americas, and on September 20, 1794, his successor, Carlos IV, issued a supplement to it, officially making instruction in Spanish free and compulsory for all. This never overcame the lack of resources needed to make it happen. The royal decrees kept coming, however. In March 1815, compulsory primary education in Spanish was imposed. In 1860, schools were instituted in the army. Spanish non-commissioned officers were to instruct their Philippine troops. In the 19th century, fairly respectable levels of school attendance were being achieved. In 1840, one child attended for every 33 inhabitants, a figure comparable with France in the same year, one child per 38 inhabitants, and in Russia, one child per 4,000.
We know that Ostler fails to mention the 1863 Public Education Act gave Filipinos free public schooling for both boys and girls. But regardless, one thing should be clear: Spanish was being pushed via education. The numbers he was quoting show a very impressive performance by Spain in Philippine education. In 1840, one child per 33 inhabitants, compared to France with one child per 38 inhabitants, versus Russia with one child per 4,000. So it's clearly not true that Spanish was never intended to be taught to Filipinos. As we see, it's actually the opposite. There were many attempts to teach Spanish, with the 1863 Education Act the ultimate game changer. This also largely explains why Filipinos were highly literate during the late Spanish period, contrary to the claims that Spain left Filipinos ignorant and uneducated. We have to make comparisons not relative to today's standards, a form of presentism, but to the standards of the time. And we were doing pretty well. It's no surprise that foreigners in the late 1800s were quite impressed with Filipino literacy. And we should also explain why Henry Jones Ford would later on comment that Filipinos were actually quite literate in his 1916 book, as mentioned in our previous video. Finally, Ostler had this to say.
But the situation compares ironically with the contest of English and Spanish in North America in the same period, where if anything, Spanish, in its versions ceded to Mexico, Central America, Cuba and Puerto Rico, is growing at the expense of English in many big cities and much of the southwest of the USA. All these developments, however, tend to underline the true determinants of language spread, population growth, and population movements.
So it looks like the loop is going full circle. The reason why so many Filipinos are learning Spanish nowadays is because of the PPO industry, catering to US clients that speak Spanish and English. And Filipinos, of course, speak English already because of our US pass. So with Spanish continuing to expand in the US, more and more we see the spillover effects of the service industry in the Philippines and the renaissance of the Spanish language as well in the Philippines. Now imagine that. In summary, what did we learn here? Number one, Spanish was not widely spoken during Spanish colonial rule in either region. Contrary to popular belief, Spanish was not universally spoken across the Spanish Empire during colonial times. In both Latin America and the Philippines, indigenous languages remained dominant for much of the colonial period. Ostler points out that Spanish spread was limited due to geography, demographics, and the prioritization of evangelization over linguistic unification. In 1810, he was saying 3 times more people spoke indigenous languages than Spanish in the Americas. Similarly, in the Philippines, while Spanish was officially promoted, it remained largely confined to urban centers and the elite, mirroring the experience in much of Spanish America. Number 2, the shift towards Spanish occurred mostly in the 19th century. It was a post-colonial push in Latin America and a late colonial push in the Philippines. Major efforts to spread Spanish language education occurred relatively late. In Latin America, Spanish only began to replace indigenous languages after independence in the 19th century, driven by nationalist policies aimed at unifying new republics in places like Mexico, etc. In the Philippines, Spanish education was intensified in the late 18th and especially the 19th century through royal decrees and eventually the 1863 Education Act. It's likely that had the US or Japan not invaded, the Philippine experience would have been quite similar to the Latin American experience, as they really paralleled each other as far as Spanish was concerned. Number 3, language spread was determined by practical realities, not just colonial intent. Ostler underscores the language adoption was shaped less by top-down policy and more by real-world factors like population movements into institutional support and community engagement. These insights help debunk simplistic myths about Spanish language spread and highlight the complex, uneven, and evolving nature of linguistic influence across the Spanish Empire. So, what do you think? Well, that's all that we have for now. Please like and subscribe to continue supporting our channel. Your help will go a long way to help us bust the myths that litter our history. Viva los Filipinos! Mabuhay!